It's statewide. Texas is a statewide adoption. Basically, from Texas, or actually the Kentucky-Tennessee border straight west, everything south is statewide adoption, and almost everything north is district by district. Hello, Houston. We're going to pick up where we left off last time in the midst of our introduction. We had been talking about how we got to the state that we're currently in terms of cognitive psychology, and I was in the process of giving you a kind of a general treatment as to what's involved in the evolution, the development of cognitive psychology. And so what I'm going to do is pick up my story with the comments that I was making last time about behaviorism in the person of John Watson as the major contributor, developer, establisher of that original area. And I guess I told you last time some of the interesting story of John Watson. So we will cut directly to the list of people and events and move on from there. So we talked about functionalism, and then the arrival of behaviorism was in the person of John Watson. And in fact, he did two major things for psychology as a discipline generally. That is, he broadened the concept of behavior, what was legal to actually be studying, and at the same time he also focused only on behavior. He seriously limited the kind of events that we were studying. Beyond that, the next major school that also developed at more or less the same time was Gestalt psychology, Gestaltism or Gestalt psychology. That approach was really kind of a gadfly on the rump of the rest of psychology, because the primary thing that people like Max Wertheimer did was more to pose problems that the other approaches, psychoanalytic, behavioral, and so forth and so on, had difficulty explaining. So in some ways, the main thing they did was to advocate, the whole is more than the sum of its parts, and yeah, that's great. But then how do you extrapolate that into how do we do research? And so in essence, although it raised some rather interesting intellectual points, Gestalt psychology was a little bit lame in terms of its emphasis on contribution to the overall impact of psychology as a whole, the development of psychology as a whole. But it did put an interesting perspective on looking at not the nitty-gritty, which is what the behaviorists tended to be after, but rather on a holistic approach to what was to be investigated. They were, however, a little bit short on explanations. Just to step in here with a kind of a personal example and to show you how relatively shallow or young our discipline is, I have actually co-authored a pamphlet, with Max Wertheimer's son, Michael Wertheimer, who is a retired professor from the University of Colorado at the time of his retirement. But we're only essentially 2 generations removed from the founding forefathers and foremothers of our discipline. It's developed relatively rapidly. But there were some other things that also happened in addition to the schools that are mentioned here, which is really the core of the basis of cognitive psychology. There was a very interesting person that you might, as well as anywhere else, file under the Gestalt approach, although that was not particularly his theoretical orientation. But he posed some rather interesting problems, and that was a gentleman by the name of Frederic Bartlett. He did some work in the 1930s that basically, or the import of which was not actually recognized for some 40 years. Beth Loftus at the University of Washington was one of the very first to do the early studies, the classic ones that she did, you may remember, should remember, was in one case she staged an automobile accident on campus at the University of Washington. She warned people what was going to happen so that they went into it fully aware. And then what she did after the accident was shown, it was actually a filmed version of an occurrence of a fender bender on campus. She went in and asked them a series of questions. We'll talk about it later in the class. But she was ultimately able to demonstrate that it was quite clear that people do not have the kind of explicit memory that we often tend to credit ourselves with in doing things like eyewitness testimony of events that happen. And the point was really, her research was almost 40 years after the original work that Bartlett had done, but it shared in common the idea that what was really going on there was essentially what they were trying to look at was not so much the nitty-gritty of short-term memory, long-term memory, and so forth, but more so at the processes. That is, when you and I are thinking or remembering things, what are the actual processes that we tend to go through? What kind of procedures do we use? That was Bartlett's contribution, and it feeds directly into the modern day cognitive psychology. So if we go back to the list, let me move on through there and show you some of the other things that happen here. So in terms of modern psychology, the traditionalists, and I really stopped that recitation back in the 1930s because it gets a little grandiose to be standing here in the midst of modern day psychology waving my arm at theoretical trends. But in essence, cognitive psychology as such derived from two major schools or approaches that have evolved over the last 20 or 30 years or so. Obviously, one of them is the work of Herbert Simon, who actually won a Nobel Prize as an economist. And yet his work is directly applicable to the work we do nowadays in cognitive psychology, in the area broadly defined as cognitive psychology. So although that Nobel Prize was back in 1978 and had to do with the role that you and I play in the broader economic structure or function, operation of the economies in the world, the processes that he was modeling there could very quickly be adapted and were adapted to the study of individual cognitive processes. So although he started very simplistically with what I believe is called a TOTE model, T-O-T-E, test, operate, test, exit. That was an early version of the kind of thing that Simon developed models to mimic. And the study there, we'll see again a little bit later, was essentially attempting to create via computer a simplistic representation of what they thought to be the fundamental thinking processes. So computer simulation really traces back to Herbert Simon, and certainly its impact on modern day psychology clearly traces to Herbert Simon. The other thing that was developing during this time was work in neuroscience, an area of our discipline has now come to be known as neuroscience. One of the very first of the contributors in that area was a person at Stanford, now at the University of Southern California, by the name of Richard Thompson. He was one of the very first to actually use brain activity and the measurement of it and try to correlate it with or track changes in brain behavior well, the original studies that he did actually involved testing the nictitating membrane of a rabbit, which was his experimental subject. And the nictitating membrane of a rabbit is not an eyelid, it's a separate filament or feature, I should say, that operates under the rabbit's eyelid, but you can condition it. And what he did was to demonstrate growth in various activities in the structures of the brain that control movement and so forth. And he was able to show that as the rabbit's behavior changed, it also altered the nature of the electrical activity in various areas of the brain. That was the first time that was ever demonstrated by Richard Thompson, and that was the predecessor of what we nowadays refer to as neuroscience. So in essence, as we look at psychology, the various subjects that we study as a whole, as a discipline, are represented by the elements that I'm laying out in the continuum here. It stretches all the way from developmental processes that can apply. In fact, we're going to look at development later on in the semester. We're going to look at development of cognitive processes. But as you can see, that's a pretty good cross-section of the major subjects that are dealt with by psychologists. What I want to point out is that what used to be called experimental as opposed to clinical psychology has now been shifted in a subtle but very interesting way. And that is that if you look at these disciplines, there is actually a subset of those stretching from physiology up through at least some components of emotion, with varying contributions also from some elements of individual differences, even testing, abnormal behavior, and development, as we'll see. But the key in our discipline, in terms of cognitive psychology, is right there. That is, it's a series of areas that stretch from parts of physiological psychology through sensory processes, which is the first thing that we're going to be looking at, through learning, through memory, through much of motivation, and some elements of emotion. And those areas basically have been collapsed into, or can be generically identified as, cognitive psychology. So let's look at it. Excuse me. In essence, at this point, we've now finished the introduction of the discipline. I didn't quite finish on the previous lecture. I did want to make one other comment that I forgot to when I was showing you the media projects or the creative projects that were done. The picture that I showed you of Freud was illustrative of the kind of thing you could do, although that did not come from a student in cognitive psychology. It was a rather creative project turned in by somebody in a section of Intro a number of years ago. So I'm not suggesting we're going to go through psychoanalysis, and Freud may not be an adequate subject, but the way in which he was presented in that drawing was really the point that I was trying to make. The other thing that I meant to do, and in the rush of showing it, I didn't get it to you, to relay it to you, was you may remember that he was pictured, drawn, sitting by a window, sucking his thumb, and the title of the drawing, which didn't show in the picture, is Oral Stage. So there was some subtlety in the nature of the project itself. But that was just to give you an idea in the previous lecture of the kind of things we have in mind as the creative project that you might get involved in. Now, today, what we're going to do is to start into our analysis of perceptual processes, and we're going to look at it, first of all, in terms of the entry points, vision and hearing, in the next couple of lectures, and then we're going to look at some of the more generic processes that are all wrapped up in the process of perceiving this world of ours. So as we begin our discussion of cognitive psychology, what I want to do is to highlight for you a feature, a couple of different elements that I think really have a significant impact on modern day psychology. There is a book written by John Steinbeck a number of years ago that really, in a way, impacts what we're doing in cognitive psychology, although it doesn't seem so, given what I'm going to be citing for you. But John Steinbeck, a world-famous author and literary figure, was actually raised in the middle California part of the state, near where Stanford has a marine station out at the coast. And it turned out that John Steinbeck, in the course of growing up, became friends, maturing, I guess I should say, became friends with one of the marine scientists at that marine station. And that scientist ultimately, way back in the 1930s, published a book called Between Pacific Tides. It was the second edition of that book when John Steinbeck was actually invited by the authors, if I remember, yes, it was Ricketts and Calvin who did the original edition, and in 1948 they did a second edition with a foreword written by John Steinbeck. And it's interesting that if you listen to what I'm going to read to you, which is a direct quote from some elements of that foreword, he's talking about scientists, but see if he ever mentions them, or the discipline for that matter. But in fact, what Steinbeck said was as follows, okay? He says essentially, there is in our community an elderly painter of seascapes who knows the sea so well that he no longer goes to look at it while he paints. He dislikes intensely the work of a young painter who sets his easel on the beach and paints things his elder does not remember having seen. Periodically in the history of human observation, the world of external reality has been rediscovered, reclassified, and redescribed. It is difficult for us to understand the reality of Democritus or Aristotle, for they did not see what we see, yet we know them to have been careful observers. The process of rediscovery might be as follows. A young, inquisitive, and original human might one morning find a fissure in the traditional technique of thinking. Through this fissure, he might look out and find a new external world about him. In his excitement, a few disciples would cluster about him and look again at the world they knew and find it fresh. From this nucleus, there would develop a frantic new seeing and a cult of new seers who, finding some traditional knowledge incorrect, would throw out the whole structure and start again. Then, the human mind being what it is, evaluation, taxonomy, arrangement, pattern making would succeed that first excited seeing. Gradually, the structure would become complete, and humans would go to this structure rather than to the external world until eventually something like, but not identical with, the earlier picture would have been built. From such architectures or patterns of knowledge, disciplines, ethics, even manners exude. The building would be complete again, and no one would look beyond it, until one day a young, inquisitive, and original human might find a fissure in the patterns and look through it and find a new world. Steinbeck from 1948. And in essence, what he's talking about is a variation of the theories, the schools of psychology that we were reciting in our previous lecture. And that's exactly what he's nailed there. And what he points out in that discussion is something that also becomes the subject of a book by Thomas S. Kuhn, who in 1962 wrote a brilliant piece on the structure of scientific revolutions. And in essence, what Kuhn highlights in that text is a fascinating look at the way in which science, with a capital S, has progressed over the centuries, and I mean literally the centuries. And what he points out, what he's developing in that book, I'm not going to give you any extensive quote from him, but in essence, what he talks about is the fact that science tends to proceed by revolution, not violent gun-toting revolution, but rather by intellectual revolution. And what he's arguing essentially is that physics is a good example. It's an easy discipline to pick on, but it also is much more mature than psychology, and it offers some examples of what I'm talking about. What Kuhn is really talking about is in essence illustrated by the work of, for instance, Albert Einstein. Okay? Einstein basically proposed a theory of relativity. At the time it was announced or developed, proposed, it basically encompassed everything that physicists knew or could predict from the phenomena and the results that they had at that point, and it also incorporated a large amount of the stuff that at that time was put in the wastebasket. Any discipline has a number of studies which, when produced, generate results that the theory simply can't explain. So you chalk it off to experimental error, or this, that, or the other kind of a cause in the experiment. But fundamentally, particularly in disciplines as precise as physics, what really began to be troubling to the discipline as a whole was the idea that we've got this whole package of data that really doesn't fit with our current theory. And in fact, it was Einstein's theory of relativity that took over the discipline. That became the illustration of, the explanation for the phenomena studied by physicists. What that says, and what Kuhn was essentially suggesting in his piece, was that essentially careers rise and fall just as disciplines do, based on the theories that are actually developed and become central to the discipline. We're going to see some examples of that. In fact, I'm going to start with that as we lead into specifically cognitive psychology, because it actually, as I thought about it, it's reflected exactly in the work that, in the piece that Steinbeck wrote way back in the 1940s and was kind of summarized in a different context by Kuhn in the 1960s. So in essence, what I'm going to argue is that there are really two signal events which lead to the establishment of modern-day psychology. So although we started with quotes from Steinbeck and Kuhn talking about scientific revolution, I want to suggest that cognitive psychology actually started essentially with a revolution. And there were two signal landmark events that occurred that really led to the establishment of modern-day cognitive psychology. The first of these was a 1956 conference that was held on September 11th, and it was summarized after the fact by George Miller, who was later an APA president and one of the early movers and shakers in the field of what became cognitive psychology, although that was not his primary area of effort. In essence, as he came away from that conference, what Miller is quoted as having said is, in fact, he wrote, "I went away from the conference with a strong conviction, more intuitive than rational, that human experimental psychology, theoretical linguistics, and computer simulation of cognitive processes were all pieces of a larger whole, and that the future would see a progressive elaboration and coordination of their shared concerns." That was in 1979 that he made that statement, but it really preceded, it anticipated the arrival of cognitive psychology as an area. There were signals that it was coming. The second event that I also want to talk about, in addition to the observations of George Miller, is another conference that was held at the University of Kentucky in 1967. And that was more widely attended, perhaps because there was interest in what was going to go on there. The conference was held in 1967, originally cast by some as the point at which traditional behaviorists and experimental psychologists were going to put these new cognitive psychologists in their place. That was the goal of the behaviorists, and it was really quite a public agenda that they had in mind. Quite the reverse is what actually happened. My dissertation director actually attended that conference during the time I was still his graduate student. And he came back as a really shook man, intellectually, because it became obvious to him as he looked at the research that was being presented by what came to be known as cognitive psychologists, that they were onto something, and that it was basically a theoretical ground shift that was occurring, about which we'll be talking most of the semester. But it occurred very precisely. It started in a formal sense at that conference at the University of Kentucky in 1967, where many of the bigwigs, both from the past and the future, got together. And Howard Polio's my dissertation director, was actually trained at the University of Michigan as a behavioral scientist. That is, he had very good training under Arthur Melton in studies of memory, but very mechanistic, small kind of studies of memory. And though not small, but the units that were being used were small, not the research itself. Sorry, Howard. But rather, what happened was that kind of research really came under serious question in that conference in 1967, and he was sharp enough that it was immediately obvious to him that something was going to change in the way he was conducting research. And in fact, during the course of the years, it did shift quite markedly, as we'll learn a little bit later here. The third thing that happened that really kind of precipitated the final development of the discipline was a book published by Ulrich Neisser way back in 1967. The book I'm showing you is one of a series of what was then called the Century Psychology series, published by a company called Appleton Century Crofts. And in 1967, Ulrich Neisser from Cornell had the audacity, I say in quotes, to come out with a book labeled simply Cognitive Psychology. And that was really the hallmark. That was the starting point of the formal discipline. Okay? By that time, things had gelled enough that he was able to put together multiple hundreds of pages of data-driven commentary on the ways in which we should be examining various cognitive phenomena. And so basically, to show you the tenor of the times, even his first chapter, he notes that cognitive processes surely exist, so it can hardly be unscientific to study them. But even in that book, he actually has to go so far as to continue to justify what he's really looking at. But in some ways, what was really happening there is a turn inward. Everything prior to that had been looking at conditioning of eye blinks and various things we could stand outside here and look at. And much of what we're going to be looking at in the course that we look at here, in the material that we look at here, is going to be much more internalized. And so basically what came away from the various conferences, Neisser's book, and the attempt to kind of focus the area, was a definition of a brand new subset of psychology, a subdiscipline within psychology called cognitive psychology. And it was defined simply as the study of symbolic mental activities such as thinking, reasoning, problem solving, and memory processes, including the conditions of storage, search, and retrieval. And if you think about the review we did yesterday at the previous lecture on the contents of the course, that pretty well summarizes the major areas that we'll be looking at. The first roughly 20% of the course is going to be looking primarily at perceptual processes. Then we'll be looking at memory processes, and we'll move from there on into various language-related processes and thinking and various language-related and cognitive processes that spin off of the internal mechanism or device concept that we're actually looking at here. So that essentially, cognitive psychology was part of cognitive science. And cognitive science in general is thought basically to examine knowledge in terms of its development, the elements of its component, and its actual use, that is, how the knowledge is actually used, as for instance in language. Because of that breadth, cognitive psychologists, cognitive science, I should say, actually includes scholars and researchers from a wide variety of different areas. Okay? It includes philosophy, psychology, linguistics, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, anthropology. Those are certainly some of the fundamental disciplines that are involved in the overall study of things like linguistics. And yet some would argue that it also includes those, for instance, in engineering, in sociology, and even in economics. Okay? So it is truly a multidisciplinary approach that is being used in this particular discipline, integrated discipline, I should say. We have a linguistics program here at the U of H, at the University of Houston, but it's not lodged in any one department. It's not in psychology or English or anywhere else specifically. Rather, it is put together as an interdisciplinary, literally a multidiscipline program. And it draws from 6-8 different departments and has events coming in English sometimes. The computer science department has events sometimes in linguistics, and so forth and so on. So we'll see as we go through the course of the semester that cognitive psychology, and specifically the study of language and linguistics, draws from a lot of different areas and kind of integrates it in a truly interdisciplinary effort all the way around. So here, we're going to emphasize predominantly the psychological component, the behavioral component of what's involved in that, though we'll also have some visitors that come and visit with us through the semester to represent several of these other fields, including, for instance, philosophy, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence, as time permits. So basically, as we start this, let's look at cognitive psychology, and specifically cognitive neuroscience. Having acknowledged, certainly from the time of Neisser's text, 1967, that thinking and various other cognitive activities are at the heart of cognition, it wasn't long before cognitive psychologists started looking inward, and that trend continues. They studied how cognitive processes are limited and yet enabled by the structure and function of the central nervous system and the brain. An obvious series of steps in which cognitive neuroscientists have engaged as measurement techniques increased in sophistication were the various successful attempts to link neuronal activity to ongoing cognitive processes. You'll remember when I talked a little earlier about Richard Thompson. His signal contribution, his major contribution in kind of putting neuroscience on the map was to demonstrate changes in neural functioning, firing rates at different areas in the brain directly correlated with the growing skill of a rabbit in learning how to anticipate a signal and blink his eyes to protect himself from a puff of air. Okay, it was a very traditional experiment, but it really bridged the gap from old behaviorism into a much newer view of cognitive neuroscientific processes and examination procedures. Okay, so where do we go from here? Well, let's look at some of the various techniques that have been developed over the years, if I can get my notes apart here, and start with the classic technique, because there's a long and interesting story that is related to this. Soldiers during World War II, following World War II, returned with VA benefits for the first time. It was the first group in modern society that came back from having defended the country in World War II and came back to a society that offered them benefits, specifically in the form of the Veterans Administration. What happened was that at about the same time, in a completely different area, a new investigation of electroencephalography was developing. That is simply, and we'll show you some examples of it here a little bit later, was putting on measuring devices on the surface of a person's head and measuring electrical activity in different areas of the brain. And it was actually the original only dynamic measure that could be applied to the human brain at that time. That is, internally, to understand what was going on. EEG offered the only direct way to measure electrical activity and try to create any kind of a correlation between what's going on in the human's environment relative to what's going on internally in terms of how that brain is actually functioning at the time. So the electrical activity that was detected by the electrodes was, of course, amplified and recorded on very fast-moving strips of paper. The average record is about 15 inches wide. And if you simply record one participant's activities over a night of sleep, you're going to be looking at a stack of 15-inch wide papers about 15 to 18 inches high. It generates a huge amount of data, partly because the EEG waves themselves are very complex, but also partly because different areas of the brain are doing different things even when the body as a whole is engaged in one activity, such as sleep. There are a lot of different things going on. And basically what What happened was that that early EEG research had to await the development of computers in order to do what's called a Fourier analysis of the complex brainwave activity that could be recorded by the EEG. So the actual utilization of brainwaves and leading of psycholinguistics or psycholinguists into the study of brainwaves and related activities had to await the development of the electroencephalograph and also the computers with which to analyze the data. And in essence, the outcome of that was rather interesting. We'll see examples of it through the course of the semester, but one of the immediate and direct results of the research that was going on in the Veterans Administration hospitals and those that were using the EEG led to the definition or the defining, the location of both Broca's area and Wernicke's area in the brain, which we'll see are two major processing areas for speaking and listening. And the way it was done is a story in and of itself. I don't have a way to illustrate it, but I can describe it pretty easily for you, and how it was done is quite obvious. And that is, given the literally millions of soldiers who were coming back into society when World War II ended, because in both the Eastern Front and the Western Front there was a definitive answer or endpoint when a truce was signed, after which a lot of people returned, many of whom were injured in one way or another, the veterans I'm talking about. Somebody came up with the idea that, well, look, we've got a certain number of people that have this kind of language problem, that kind of a language problem, another kind of language problem. So in fact, why don't we use this fancy new X-ray that we've got? Let's take a side view, an image of the head from the same perspective in each case of all the people that share this, that, or the other common symptom in common. They did that. And then what they were able to do was to overlap the photographs on top of each other. I should say the X-rays. They could overlap the X-rays on top of each other. And one of the uses to which the computer could be put is, given that we have this consistent set of symptoms in person X, Z, A, and L, or something like that, what area of the brain is always involved? So basically what the computer did was an overlap analysis of different X-rays of people who shared in common only a single malady in language. It might have been in listening, it might have been in producing. If you think about it a minute, language actually, the use of language in one way or another to communicate, actually involves 4 different activities. 2 are input, you're either reading or listening, and 2 are output. You're either talking or writing. And it turns out when you do a 2-by-2 table of those features, there are 4 different disabilities that may occur. That is, you may have trouble with input. That is, you can't, it's a receptive aphasia. Aphasia is the language difficulty I'm talking about there, basically. And that's a brain-caused difficulty with language-related processes. But in essence, the way they stumbled into that originally was simply taking everybody who came to be known as a receptive aphasic, doing an overlap analysis of their X-rays to narrow down the specific area of the brain that was always involved when that condition showed up. And it was really one of the first direct benefits of utilizing physiological evidence to monitor or determine what was actually going. What is the link between physiological activity and the language skills that are impacted there? I guess the one other thing I should talk about maybe is to talk just for a second about aphasia, which is just a brain-based problem with language. It's that generically defined as a brain-based problem with language. But the symptoms are pretty obvious. If you have, for instance, someone who has what is called expressive aphasia, the problem is that you could bring them into a particular area in a room or something, point to an object out in the yard, and say, what is that? And an expressive aphasic, tell me the name of that, will do what is called circumlocute. That's one of the common symptoms that you find. You ask them to name an object, and what they'll do is talk around it. Okay, trunk, brown, leaves, fall in the winter, fall in the fall, different colors. And they can name all sorts of feature about trees, and yet they can't look at that object and say it's a tree. That's the difficulty of expressive aphasia. Okay? And yet, it isn't the inability to say tree, because you can take them into your own apartment and point out the object that you put into a shoe to help it retain its shape and ask them what that is, and they can tell you immediately, oh, that's a shoe tree. So it is not the inability to say tree. It's not a speech difficulty. It's an intellectual, it's a cognitive difficulty. And that's why aphasia is such a relatively important disorder in our subject. And that is, it really demonstrates the difference between pure speech and the difficulties of mechanically reproducing it versus the cognitive issues that we'll be dealing with this semester, the internal factors that can get screwed up, and the various ways when it's working in which they work fine. Now, what I'd like to do here is to review 6 or 7 of the most commonly used modern-day techniques for studying the brain, show you the labels of them, and give you a sample of in some cases, how the measurements are conducted. Some of them are so relatively unsophisticated that we'll just talk about them but move past them. There are, however, some techniques that have evolved out of this array that are still used quite actively nowadays and yield some rather interesting results. So first, what we're going to look at is how we're going to understand brain activity. And we're going to do that by basically looking first of all at what's called brain electrical activity mapping, BEAM. Now what that does is probably reasonably well conveyed just by the title itself. Okay? Essentially it provides via computer color maps of brain electrical activity, and it will have different colors indicating different levels of activity. That device, developed very early on, turns out to be universally utilized. That is, color is most often used as an indicator of the relative amount of electrical activity in any given area of the brain. So we'll see that consistently across each of the things I'm going to show you here. That kind of a procedure, BEAM, is non-invasive, and it's used to diagnose various kinds of brain diseases, some of which impact language, such as, for instance, dyslexia and dementia. Both of those have language components or language deficit components that are a factor in that technique. So the BEAM procedure utilizes a computer to convert data from brain electrical potentials into colored topographical maps. Topographical or area relevant maps of the brain. Those maps can then be compared with maps of an appropriate control group to indicate the degree of deviation in expected norms. That is, if you take the cognitive map, the colored map developed by BEAM, you can compare anyone with a suspected difficulty and look at the relative amount of electrical activity in that person's brain when they're doing something relative to what a normal person has done when measured at the same time. And so in essence, again, it's a complex comparison. It may often rely on computers, but it is nonetheless utilizing control versus experimental as a traditional comparison. Another one we can also talk about is event-related potentials, or also called ERP. They're also called evoked potentials or evoked response potentials. All three of those labels are sometimes utilized or defined simply as ERP, labeled as ERP. What this measures is changes in patterns in brain activity in response to specific external stimuli. You will remember that Hubel and Wiesel's classic work on developing or defining the role of the occipital lobe was based on, if you've seen his original work, was based on a frog that had been operated on where his eyes were preserved. The eyes of the frog were preserved so that he could look out at a screen in front of the frog. And what they would do with access to the occipital cortex of the frog is to highlight just a pinpoint of light anywhere around a grid in front of the area where the frog was looking. And then what they were tracing was when we have a light in area X, probably 4 different letters to label it, where is the electrical activity in the brain? And it was from that very precise cognitive mapping, brain mapping, that they were ultimately able to develop the concept of stacked cells and the various other things that go into how our eyes actually operate through the occipital lobe, through interpretive events that take place in the occipital lobe. So, in essence, I want to show you an illustration of how this can actually be done. And this is a picture of a young lady who is actually, the picture is supplied by, it's drawn from the lab of Helen Jane Neville, who's in the Brain Development Lab at the University of Oregon. This is showing what a subject looks like when attached to the measuring equipment that are used in various ERP studies. So basically what's involved for this young lady, for any subject, is to put on an elasticized cap that has electric discs that are woven into it. Okay, and so the white dots that you see are actually various measurement points across the skull that are used. There is a standard map where those points are normally measured worldwide. There is an agreed upon map that the EEG measures and various related techniques tend to use when they're measuring electrical activity in different points. And so basically the discs have a small amount of gel which is put under them to stabilize the electrical activity that's being measured. So if the subject moves a little bit and the skull cap shifts, it doesn't impact the actual stability of the measures that you're getting in that activity. And basically what happens then is that the subject is in there for sessions that run anywhere from 2 to 8 hours across a 2-day session. It's typically split into no more than 4 hours on a given day, but it may run as much as 8 hours of measurement across what is usually a 2-day session. Typically what the subject is doing is sitting in a chair, such as you see there on the screen. The participant views various kinds of visual stimuli, such as images, usually of known identifiable objects, or printed words, and so forth, in the visual modes. And so basically what you can also do is to measure and analyze. You can also present stimuli in the oral mode, that is listening, such as spoken language or a wide variety of possible sounds. So this particular measurement technique actually doesn't limit at all the kind of things that linguists and neuroscientists are ultimately interested in, visual or oral. But the measurement technique, while the participant is doing this, that is, while they're actively engaged in whatever task they've been assigned to conduct while they're being measured, his or her brain waves, brain electrical activity is being recorded, utilizing the electrical discs as input as the participant views visual or listens to auditory cues. That's basically the fundamental process on which the research technique itself is based. If decision-making is being studied, the participant may sometimes be asked to push a button when certain stimuli are detected. It's an interesting link between the computerized mechanical measures of brain waves and the participant's actual experience. You'll see that there are several different techniques that are being used here, essentially to establish the correlation between what happens in the brain as different physical events are being conducted, different physical responses are being required, or different kinds of stimuli are being supplied into the brain. But it was this technique, the ERP, that was one of the first to make this kind of a connection. There are some others that we can look at because we don't need to measure only electrical activity. There are other measures that can be used. One of those would be what is sometimes referred to as RCBF, or regional cerebral blood flow. The title, again, is precise enough that it kind of suggests what is going on there. But as suggested in the title, this involves measuring the amount of blood flow to a specific region of the brain. Studies can then involve things like relating that blood flow to the activities in which the participant may be involved while his or her RCBF is being measured. So that one is pretty straightforward and simple. There's another one, a little more sophisticated, and I'm going to show you three, all of which share things in common, which I'll come back and talk about here in a minute. But another one that is sometimes used, and I had to actually decrease the print because this label is big enough here, so I hope you can still see it. But I'll read it off for you, and that is single proton emission computed tomography, often called SPECT, S-P-E-C-T. SPECT can be used to differentiate among different kinds of disease processes which produce, for instance, dementia, and it is increasingly used for this kind of a purpose. It normally requires the use of a rapid uptake radioactive isotope, and it is effective in measuring blood distribution in response to brain activities, especially immediately after events such as seizures have occurred. The process of having somebody hooked up is a kind of catch-as-catch-can thing, because we're certainly not going to create seizures in people to measure them. But it can be very helpful in nailing down what kind of changes in electrical activity occur when those seizures actually occur. One of the reasons I'm only skimming over it is the fact that its resolution is not particularly good as a measurement technique. And it's limited by the rapid time and deterioration of the radioactive tracer. That is, you're dealing there with half-lives, which I'm not going to get into a whole lot, but its total potential as a sensed fluid or liquid is limited by the relatively short half-life. And in fact, what that means, I mean, there's some other things that end up happening here as a consequence. You have to be within a certain distance of the lab where these things are produced. And there are just all sorts of limits that are imposed on research that would involve SPECT. But the one that I do want to spend some time on is what is called positive emission tomography, or the PET scan, that you have heard about and that has been widely used over the years. In this case, what you do is inject a radioactive chemical which is active in basic metabolic activity in the bloodstream. You'll notice now that we've shifted entirely from electrical activity into looking at the supplying of nutrients that support the kind of brainwave activity that we're measuring here. Measured over time, it utilizes X-rays of the radioactive substances that are deposited in the brain. We can achieve a time-related sample of what areas of the brain are active in relation to any particular activity, whether it be talking or listening, reading or writing, in 2 or 3 dimensional images. It's a very useful tool. Okay? It's particularly useful in measuring, for instance, the amount of brain activity as a function of which area of the brain we're studying. That is, we can get a time-related measure of both the increase and the decrease in brainwave activity in a technique that I'll show you here in a minute. One of the earliest and biggest problems, again, is the relatively short half-life of the isotopes that are being used. And that limits the time length of the processes which can actually be measured utilizing this technique. So even though the technique is there, the tools that are utilized in some cases limit what can actually be measured in this. So we're kind of moving toward the ability to track this more accurately. But this SPECT and then PET was one of the earliest attempts to do that effectively. It's very sensitive in picking up early signs, for instance, of things like Alzheimer's. One of the difficulties we have with Alzheimer's, but psychologists, medical folks generally, have with Alzheimer's is the fact that those early effects for someone who is destined to succumb to Alzheimer's is the fact that the effects which are there and measurable are very scattered across the brain. It may show up very simplistically in an inability to recall a single word or a single friend's name or something like that. That can be very difficult to analyze, and it's a universal problem among scientists and engineers. I have a car that I'm driving right now that has an inability to keep parking lights going. And, sorry, the example I was going to use was a fuel gauge. That every now and then the fuel gauge dies. And every time it happens, I take it into the dealer, and invariably, when they shut the car down and then look at it later, the fuel gauge is working fine. So it's one of those things that's there and then gone. And in this case, the same kind of a problem. The short life of the measurement tools kind of limits the extent to which they can analyze something. But basically, changes in such activity, digestive and energy-firing activities in supporting the activity of the neurons, can be very sensitively measured by something like a PET scan. Various patterns of activation can be detected depending on whether the brain is, for instance, resting or alert or performing various specific kinds of cognitive tasks, such as looking for a needle in a haystack. And through the course of various kinds of neurological and psychiatric diseases, the PET scan becomes a very important measuring device. This is kind of a control image. This is what a PET scan looks like in a normal brain. There's not a lot of detail in that because the image has been reproduced several times. It comes from the Governmental Institute of Aging, so I want to give them credit for it. But in essence, what you're seeing there, again, is the use of color to indicate the relative degree of activity at any given time. There's another one that you will also be familiar with, and that is what's called computed tomography, which has had a couple of different names. But CT scan originally was called CAT scan. What's now called the CT scan is able to reveal small, very subtle changes in brain structure that occur with stroke, with tumors, and with various other kinds of disorders. Unlike, and give me a second on this, pneumoencephalography. You want to try to introduce that into a cocktail party this weekend. Pneumoencephalography. Unlike pneumoencephalography and arteriography, the CT scan is non-invasive. The other two I was talking about are invasive in one way or another. This one is an outside measure, and that increases its value. It holds no risks, but it offers the ability to construct a direct picture of structures and lesions in the brain to identify areas that have been destroyed. X-rays from various points are beamed through the head, falling on a detector on the opposite side. And a computer then takes that information to construct a series of horizontal, two-dimensional pictures of the brain. Different densities of blood, bone, gray and white matter, and cerebrospinal fluid are all quite visible in the end product of a CT scan. The net result, another technique that I want to introduce to you, is magnetic resonance imagery, which has now undergone a resolution which we'll talk about here in a minute. But in essence, magnetic resonance imagery is also non-invasive, like PET and the CT scan. MRI originally was called nuclear magnetic resonance, NMR, and it has now been shifted and is labeled instead, that same process is instead labeled MRI now, magnetic resonance imaging, I should say. You'd be interested that I looked up MRI in terms of magnetic resonance imaging on the web. And at the time I wrote these notes, there were 10.2 million references to magnetic resonance imaging. It is a very hot research topic right now. And yet, if you go into the web with the same sequence, magnetic resonance imagery, which is the more traditional use, there are only about 7.2 million references to it. It's a very quiet area. But in fact, the preferred terminology would seem to be, among the discipline in general, is magnetic resonance imaging as the technique that's actively involved. Excuse me. It involves a very complex process of, let me back up a little bit. There's one other thing I meant to indicate, that it offers very high-resolution pictures of the brain, with the added advantage that it does not require either high-energy radiation, but rather it uses magnetic fields. So this is a technique that doesn't use radiation at all. It simply uses variations in magnetism. And the way it's used is more subtle than just waving a magnet over your head. Specifically, it involves a very complex process of literally aligning most of the nuclei in atoms with odd numbers of proteins and neutrons, such as, for instance, hydrogen, which has one, with a lateral magnetic field. MRI captures the energy that is released when nuclei momentarily oriented crosswise in a briefly imposed lateral magnetic field return to their original alignment with the more powerful field. That is, when the lateral field is eliminated, which caused the twist, what it's actually measuring then is the snap of the elements returning to their original source of alignment. It gets pretty sophisticated in some of these measurement techniques. The energy thus released is used to create a high-resolution picture of the brain's structure. If you want to follow up on this and some of the various techniques with a more detailed emphasis, Julia Hane on our faculty and Levine published a very detailed presentation of these early measurement techniques back in 1987, which has a really nice labeling of the individual techniques and then the procedures that are labeled by each of those. Although the notes I'm drawing from have been pulled from sources more recent than that, but that was a good early source on these various techniques. The major change that has taken place in magnetic resonance imagery is indicated by the shifting that occurred in a particular measurement technique, and that is now what it is called is functional magnetic resonance imaging, okay? And that is referred to as fMRI. By contrast, fMRI is good for structural portraits of the brain, but it can also be used for images revealing brain function, in which a picture may be taken during the midst of a specific activity and then compared to images taken earlier in the time sequence and or later in the time sequence, so that it's basically possible to study brain activity without so much impact of the participant's physical actions, such as button pushing, at the moment of measurement. And the result of that is that things like fMRI is useful in the study of perception, of thought processes, of various kinds of physical reactions or responses and actions independently. That is, independent of the changes in the electrical field that might normally happen if the subject is moving. Basically, it's relating, as the others have been, brain activity to each experience independently. The slide that I want to show you here, I have not been able to identify the source of, but it's particularly important to pay attention to this slide for a minute, because you can begin to see what the fMRI can do for us, given the way in which it's conducted. What it does is to show the complexity of processes that can be studied with this very sophisticated measurement technique. The green and yellow colors simply show, as the previous slide did, the relative amount of activity at the time the slide was taken, that is, at the point of measurement. Okay? Notice two things about this slide, however, when you examine it, and color is important here. First, there is the increased presence of red around some of the areas. And what that shows is that there has been an increase in activity over the time period that's measured. I'm talking, for instance, and I'm using a pointer here, if you can follow it, up here. This whole area has become active over the time sequence being measured. And you'll notice also there is a bit of a hint of red around this area and also around this area. That is indicative of areas of the brain where activity is actually increasing related to whatever the subject has been asked to do, whether it's perceptual, motor, observational, thinking, or whatever area happens to be being measured at this particular time. That's one of the things that can be developed. And that's a one-time shot that's being taken there, and yet you can see kind of the past and the future of what's going on. Secondly, if you'll also notice, there is a presence of blue on the inside of some of the active areas. Okay? What this demonstrates is how much of an area is still active relative to the last time the image was copied. That is, in this case, it's a sign of decreasing activity. And so in the diagram here, you'll notice this figure has a very clear blue outline where the green is still there, indicating electrical activity in that portion. Over here, you've got the blue outline with green in the middle, and the same thing here. So these three areas, according to this activity, this measure, are actually in decrease. That is, activity, electrical activity in this area is in decline in whatever process is being measured. You'll notice, for instance, there's a hint of green here and here, but no blue, which would indicate then that those two areas are stable in the amount of electrical activity they are demonstrating at this particular time sequence. Okay, so that in essence you can use the chemicals to begin to spell out the past and the future of any particular event that you choose to measure. What's depicted here is what's called BOLD, which is the blood oxygenation level dependent measure of metabolic activity. That's specifically what's being measured with this particular fMRI technique. Okay? I have now buried you in details, but at least you'll have a thumbnail description of any of the techniques that we mentioned during the course of the lecture. And I promise you this will not be primarily a lecture in physiological psychology, so relax. Instead, what we're going to do is look at a variety of things related to cognitive activity. And there I want to specifically start with an analysis of artificial intelligence for a variety of reasons. This is a computer-based technique for developing computer programs basically to mimic cognitive processing in things like, for instance, memory or learning or problem solving, any of the kind of fundamental cognitive processes that we tend to engage in. One of the perennial problems with such approaches is captured in a comment by Neisser way back in that 1967 text, in which he wrote, "None of them does even remote justice to the complexity of human mental processes." Again, he's talking about models of artificial intelligence here. "Unlike humans, artificially intelligent programs tend to be single-minded, undistractable, and unemotional. Moreover, they are generally equipped from the beginning of each problem with all of the cognitive resources necessary to solve it." And that remains a fundamental criticism of difficulty that such programs have to deal with computer simulation or computer and artificial intelligence in any technique. It's very difficult to build a machine that doesn't have the answers already built into it. And much of what makes you and I unique is the information-seeking ability that we have. That's fundamentally what is driving our development of language, the thought processes we engage in to solve this, that, or the other problem, and so forth. Capturing that by computer has been difficult. So computers and their operating principles are the latest physical models, and there have been several down through the years, sought to parallel cognitive abilities. The idea is to study the model, learn about us with fewer impediments. Okay? The idea in creating something like artificial intelligence is to develop a model where we can study the model as long as it parallels us pretty precisely. There are similarities. For instance, the ability to store large amounts of data and apply analyses to it. You and I are both capable of that. Okay? But there are differences. Computers, by comparison, can store and summarize staggering quantities of data. If you think about the PeopleSoft system that we're now using in the U of H, don't get me started on PeopleSoft, but if you think about that, any of us, and we have what, 35, 36, 37,000 students enrolled right now, all of us, and there's faculty on top of that, another 1,000, 1,500 people, all of us are able to get onto that computer and get to our individual records. Or if I need I now have, through the wonders of PeopleSoft, the ability to email each of you, even though you're in a lecture class rather than one where I've actually sat you down and had you write down the email address. That is a staggering amount of information which is available when the system's working within 2 or 3 seconds to me. You name the class you're in and I get to your record as a subset, as one of, in the fall when I have the big introductory lecture sections, I'll have 500 people in a section. It takes me about 2 seconds to get to the relevant information of any given student. And that's something that computers do that we are never going to be able to do. That's an advantage to them, except when it comes time to let the computer mimic how you and I think, because it has access to staggering amounts of information at any given time. So we've got to kind of create some limits on what we allow the computer to have. Think about the slow progress in talking, in computer analysis of talking. That's another kind of difficulty that we've had. It's communicating is basically what's going on there. But if you think about we now get information normally by computer when we dial in a phone, when we seek information. You dial in the phone, and the computer comes on and asks you what name you want, who you're seeking. And if you give them a piece of information like G.K. Smith, it can give you the answer, usually, or Smith George, or it'll tell you it will limit your input to George Smith, or something like that. But on the other hand, if you ask for the number of the gas station that's at the corner of Chimney Rock and Bel Air, it's going to be a lot more difficult. And in fact, you very quickly overload the system. We'll talk later about specifically what went on to that, but there are problems I guess the problem that I'm suggesting there is that the lack of comparison is based on the fact that the data that computers have accessible is huge by comparison to what we work with, and yet at the same time, we have mental flexibilities that computers can't even begin to imitate. So there's a bit of a mismatch between computers as a model of you and I. The net result of that, however, is that Matlin does a very nice job of kind of dividing and conquering the issue that's involved there. She talks at one point about pure AI. And what she's really talking about there is that's for the effetes, my word rather than hers. But in essence, if you go back and look, in May of 1977, IBM, in the form of Big Blue, which is what it's called, named its computer Deep Blue. After a contest, they actually ran a contest to name the computer that was actually being built by IBM, the specific goal of which was to beat Garry Kasparov, who was at that time the reigning chess champion, world chess champion. And sure enough, in May 1997, he lost the match. That is, for the first time over a series of chess matches, the balance came out in favor of Deep Blue, and that was a major victory for IBM, simply as the ability to beat a machine that could play chess. And as you may or may not know, one of the things I was staggered to find out is that in chess, there are something like 10 to, I think it was the 120th power of moves that you can potentially make in a chess game. Now, that obviously is included not only the shortest number of moves to get the victory, but it also includes the functionally infinite number of mistake moves that you can make. But if you multiply 10 times 120. That is more molecules than there are in the entire universe as we understand it. So it's just phenomenal how to try to capture that game. And so basically, the idea that IBM was ultimately able to do that. The first victory, and I had note of it here, was about a year and a half earlier, where the computer had actually defeated Kasparov, but that was only one time. It did not win the match. So it took until May of '97 for that victory ultimately to occur. But that's pure AI. It's in a very limited benefit. It's an interesting computer problem. Can you program a machine to actually be sensitive to, that's the wrong word to use, be able to scan the various decisions it can make and choose the correct path toward victory? What Matlin also talks about, and generically is true as a topic, is computer simulation. That is, Deep Blue ultimately would beat Kasparov. The task could be accomplished, but it couldn't serve coffee. Okay? It couldn't tell when Kasparov had a cold. So there are a lot of things that that computer was not able to do. And the result is that rather than pure AI, what we've tended to move into is simulation attempts to factor in and try to mimic the limits of, first of all, what we are capable of producing, and secondly, the manner in which we do it. There's an example in the Matlin text of the fact that when you and I read a complex sentence, particularly one that has a phrase buried within it, what you really have to do, and that's a very sophisticated piece of cognition that you and I are quite capable of doing. You read a sentence within which there is a phrase, a paragraph, a section is what I'm looking for. You basically start the processing of the sentence itself, and then you have to suspend that while you use exactly the same apparatus to reprocess the phrase within the sentence. And that's a really sophisticated cognitive act, and ultimately we've got to be able to study by computer what is going on there. But in essence, the effectively mimicking the strengths and the weaknesses that we have, our deviations from normal behavior, is where AT&T ultimately was able to develop a reasonably functional computerized information operator. The key was informants, okay? One of the skills that you and I carry around that you've probably never even thought about is that if I were to come in someday with laryngitis or a deep cold and talk to you in a very low voice, I might actually do the entire lecture and not once overlap the frequencies with which a soprano would talk to you in a very high, squeaky voice. And yet you and I would have no trouble understanding both of them. That was the problem that the computer folks ran into. And it was basically solved when they discovered what are called formants, which is that when you and I speak to each other, there is a ratio of 1, 2, and 3 frequencies that are constantly present in our voice, despite what other nuances may make us interesting or not interesting to listen to. But it wasn't until those formants were identified that they were finally able to realize that those formants exist in basses, much more compressed, but they're there, the ratio of the first and the second and the third primary frequency, and they're also there in the sopranos, where the waves are much more spread out. But the formants are standard, and that's what they're actually using now to cue a more accurate response that will typically give you an answer in that kind of a situation. That really came out of simulation rather than a pure effort. And then let's also spend some time, and I'm not sure whether I'll be able to get through all of this by the end of the program, but there is another thing within the first couple of chapters in Matlin that I would also like to talk to you about, and that is what's called, I had all these elegant events for you, and we didn't even get to show it to you. But in any case, what is called parallel distributed processing. That's a key event, okay? And she spends some time on it. The idea actually traces back to a 1968 text that was developed by James McClelland and David Rumelhart, a classic, and it was titled simply, surprise, Parallel Distributed Processing. The situation is the following. One of the effects of behaviorism had been the idea that you and I are very mechanistic, and that was the way we were going to study you and I. A leads to B leads to C, and so forth. And so one of the original models of things like talking, communicating with each other, would obviously have to have a device that has both listening and speaking as part of its capabilities. Whether it uses the same apparatus or not is a separate issue, but it's got to have both input and output capabilities. The original, some of the earliest simplistic models had the idea that basically when you're processing the language that I'm offering here, the first thing you do is to look at or interpret the phonemes, the sounds that were actually presented. Secondly, you look at the semantics. What a meaning do you attach to the words that I give to you? And then thirdly, you look at the syntax, the structure of the sentence that I've actually utilized. And it was thought to be a serial process. Sound first, attach meaning, define the sentence, develop the sentence, structure the sentence. The problem with that is very easy to illustrate. And that is if you're talking to somebody, arguing, for instance, with somebody, it's easiest in an argument. If you're arguing with somebody who talks very slowly, it is a royal pain in the neck. Because yeah, you've got a disagreement, and most of us want to resolve those disagreements when they occur. But if the person talks very slowly, you have had time to process all of the language, and by the time they finally stop, you're ready to go. But in fact, that turns out to be true even if they speak very rapidly. You may have to throw in an or really or something like that, but fundamentally, when you and I are arguing with each other, the elements of the disagreement are scoped out very rapidly. And the net result is that when you're arguing with somebody, when they finish, you start. There just is not enough time to separately interpret the phonemes, assign meaning, and structure that meaning into sentences. It just won't work. So that was the reason that things like parallel distributed processing were originally proposed. It's very clear that in conversation, we hear the phonemes of the word, we assign meaning to the words, and then we place it in a sentence and discover the meaning of the message as a whole. It does not happen in serial, it's going on in parallel. All three processes are going on. They start at the same point, do their various things, and then end up resulting in an interpretation, a meaning that you can assign to the task. Let me show you another example, and then I'll get into the details of what she's talking about. And that is, when you think about it, if you shut your eyes, try it at home, or even here where you're not familiar. Shut your eyes, turn your head, open your eyes for just a second, about as long as you blink, and then shut them again. And what you'll find is that by doing that, you have almost a complete interpretation of what you're looking at in just what, the 10th of a second, the 5th of a second that your eyes have actually been open. The processing of that information simply cannot go on in parallel. It has to go on, in series. It cannot be a sequential process by which you open your eyes and close it and recognize there's a window ahead of me, there's a monitor over there, there's a clock over there, there are desks receding here, there's a person here, a person, and so forth. It's just, it has to be done as an all or none process. It has to go on simultaneously. And that really is the reason why the entire concept of parallel distributed processing was developed. And what I'd basically like to do is to stop the lecture at this point, and we will pick up with parallel distributed processing at the beginning of the very next lecture, second in perception.